The richest man who ever lived sat alone in his palace, surrounded by everything a human being could ever want. And he wrote down a single sentence that would echo across 3,000 years. Everything is meaningless. This was not a poor man complaining about a life he never had the chance to live. This was not a failure looking for excuses to explain away his disappointments. This was Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, a man who had gold beyond counting, 1,000 women in his house, armies at his command, and wisdom so profound that kings and queens traveled from distant lands just to sit in his presence and hear him speak. The Queen of Sheba herself, when she witnessed his wealth and his wisdom firsthand, said that the half had not been told to her. And yet, at the end of his life, when he had tried everything the world had to offer, when there was no pleasure left untasted and no ambition left unfulfilled, he sat down and wrote a book that strips away every illusion we build our lives on. Ecclesiastes is not a comfortable book. It does not promise you success if you follow 7 easy steps. It does not tell you that everything happens for a reason in a neat little bow, tied up before the credits roll. It tells you the truth, the hard truth, the truth. Most people spend their entire lives running from, distracting themselves from, medicating themselves against. And by the end of it, that same king who saw through every illusion, who tested every possible source of meaning available to a human being, gives you the one answer that actually holds weight. Stay with me today, because these 10 lessons from Ecclesiastes are not just ancient philosophy from a dusty scroll. They are a mirror held up to your own life. And what you see in that mirror, if you are honest with yourself, might just change the rest of your days on this earth. Lesson 1. Everything is vanity. Solomon opens his book with words that have shocked and unsettled readers for nearly 3,000 years. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. In the original Hebrew, the word translated as vanity is hevel, and it does not simply mean foolishness or emptiness, the way we often assume when we read it in English. Hevel means vapor, breath, mist, smoke rising from a fire, something you can see clearly for a single moment and then watch dissolve before you can ever close your hand around it. Solomon is not saying that life has no value whatsoever. He is saying something far more precise and far more unsettling. He is saying that life, as we desperately try to grasp it, control it, and make it permanent, slips through our fingers like smoke no matter how tightly we try to hold on. Consider what Solomon had actually accomplished by the time he wrote these words. According to the historical record in the Book of Kings, he had built the great temple in Jerusalem, a structure so magnificent it took 7 years and tens of thousands of laborers to complete. He built himself a palace that took 13 years to construct. He built houses, he planted vineyards with his own hands, he made gardens and parks and filled them with every kind of fruit tree. He constructed pools of water to irrigate forests of growing trees. He accumulated silver and gold in such quantities that the text says silver was as common as stone in Jerusalem during his reign. He had singers, both men and women, and he had the delights of the sons of man, which many scholars understand to reference a great harem. He denied his eyes nothing they desired and did not withhold his heart from any pleasure. And after all of it, after every house was built and every garden planted and every pleasure sampled, he turned to look back at everything his hands had made, everything he had labored to achieve, and he saw with total clarity that it was all vapor, a chasing after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. This is the moment that every single person eventually faces, whether they are 25 years old and just beginning to climb, or 75 years old and looking back at a completed climb. It is the moment when you look honestly at what you have built, what you have accumulated, what you have achieved, and you ask yourself the question you have been avoiding for years. Was any of it real? Did any of it actually satisfy the deep ache that started this whole pursuit in the first place? Solomon is not writing this to depress you or to strip away your motivation to work hard and build a good life. He is writing this as a warning from someone who has already run the entire experiment, so that you do not have to waste your own life running it again. He is trying to wake you up before it is too late, before you spend 60 or 70 years chasing something that was never designed to satisfy you in the way you hoped it would. Lesson 2. There is a time for everything. In one of the most quoted and most beloved passages in all of Scripture, immortalized centuries later in folk songs and set to music that has been sung by millions who may not even know its origin, Solomon writes that there is a time for everything and a season for every activity under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot what was planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to keep silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Many people read this passage as simply a beautiful poem about balance, and there is real beauty in it, but underneath the poetry lies a statement about the sharp limits of human control. We are not the ones who determine the seasons of our own lives, however much we would like to believe otherwise. We cannot force spring to arrive early just because we have grown impatient with the cold. We cannot make winter end sooner because we are exhausted and ready to move on from our grief. Solomon, remember, had tried to control nearly every aspect of his kingdom through wisdom, through wealth, through sheer force of will, and even he had to eventually admit that there exists a rhythm to human existence that no man, however powerful, however wise, however wealthy, can simply override through effort or determination. This lesson asks something genuinely difficult of us, something that goes against every instinct our modern culture trains into us. It asks us to stop fighting against the season we currently find ourselves in. If you are living through a season of loss right now, you cannot rush yourself into premature healing before you have actually allowed yourself to weep. If you are in a season of building something new, whether a career, a family, or a ministry, you cannot skip ahead to the harvest before you have done the slow, unglamorous work of planting and tending. The wisdom embedded in this passage is not a call toward passive resignation, as though we should simply give up trying to shape our lives. It is a call toward the far harder discipline of living fully and honestly inside the moment God has actually placed you in, rather than constantly wishing yourself forward or backward into a different one. Lesson 3. The pursuit of pleasure never satisfies. Solomon conducted what might reasonably be called history's first documented and most extensive experiment in hedonism, and unlike nearly every person who has ever attempted something similar, he had the resources to take the experiment further than anyone before or since. He tells us directly, "I said in my heart, 'Come now, I will test you with pleasure, enjoy yourself.' And behold, this also was vanity." He tested laughter and found it to be madness, and of pleasure he asked, "What use is it?" He explored, cheering his body with wine, while his mind still guided him with wisdom, wanting to lay hold of folly just long enough to see what was good for the sons of man to do under heaven during the few days of their life. He built vineyards for himself. He made gardens and parks, and planted every kind of fruit tree in them. He made pools of water to water a forest of growing trees. He bought male and female slaves, and had slaves born in his house. He also had great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been in Jerusalem before him. He also gathered for himself silver and gold, and the treasure of kings and provinces. He got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the sons of man. So he became great and surpassed all who were before him in Jerusalem, and his wisdom remained with him. And whatever his eyes desired he did not keep from them. He kept his heart from no pleasure, for his heart found pleasure in all his toil, and this was his reward for all his toil. Then he looked on all the works that his hands had done, and the toil he had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity and a chasing after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. This is perhaps the single most important experiment in recorded human history, because the overwhelming majority of us will never have access to the resources required to test this theory for ourselves. We assume, almost without question, that if we simply had more money, more indulgence, more novel experiences, we would finally arrive at the satisfaction that currently eludes us. Solomon had truly unlimited access to every conceivable pleasure, and he reports back to us plainly and without hedging that it led absolutely nowhere. The dopamine faded. The novelty inevitably wore off. The emptiness returned, and by his own account, it often returned worse than it had been before the pleasure was pursued. This lesson functions as a warning wrapped in royal experience, tested at a scale none of us could ever replicate. If the one man in history with everything available to him could not find lasting satisfaction through pleasure, our own attempts to chase it with vastly fewer resources will lead us to the same dead end, only with more debt accumulated, more relationships damaged along the way, and more irreplaceable years wasted in the pursuit. Lesson 4. Wisdom itself is vanity. You might reasonably expect Solomon, a man whose name has become nearly synonymous with wisdom itself throughout human history, to at least find lasting peace in knowledge and understanding, even if wealth and pleasure had failed him. Instead, he delivers one of the most sobering and counterintuitive lines in the entire book. In much wisdom is much grief, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. Solomon set his heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly, and he perceived that this also was but a striving after wind. He discovered, as he tells us, that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness, that the wise person has eyes in his head while the fool walks in darkness. And yet, he continues, I perceive that the same event happens to all of them. Then he said in his heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? He concluded that this too was vanity. There is no enduring remembrance of the wise man any more than of the fool, seeing that in the days to come both will have long since been forgotten. This is a genuinely devastating realization for anyone who has built their entire sense of self-worth around the accumulation of knowledge and understanding. Anyone who believes that if they simply learn enough, read enough books, earn enough degrees, understand enough about the world, they will finally achieve the inner peace that has eluded them. Solomon discovered through hard experience that wisdom actually increases one's awareness of suffering rather than shielding a person from it. The wise person sees injustice more clearly than the fool ever could. The wise person understands the reality of mortality more deeply and more painfully. The wise person recognizes patterns of futility in the world that the foolish, blissfully unaware, never even notice. Knowledge, in other words, does not insulate you from grief the way we so often assume it will. In many important ways, it exposes you to considerably more of it, because ignorance was, in some strange and almost merciful sense, protecting you from seeing clearly how the world actually operates beneath the surface. This does not mean, of course, that we should therefore choose ignorance over understanding. It means we should stop expecting wisdom alone, however genuine and hard-won, to save us from the deeper ache that Solomon is diagnosing throughout this entire book. Wisdom without something far greater to anchor it eventually becomes just another sophisticated form of vanity, another vapor that looks solid until you try to hold it. Lesson 5. Labor without meaning is torment. Solomon now turns his considerable attention to the subject of work, something every human being who has ever lived spends the overwhelming majority of their waking hours engaged in, whether in a field, a factory, an office, or a home. He writes with startling honesty that he hated all his toil in which he had toiled under the sun, seeing that he must leave everything he had built to the man who would come after him. And who knows, he asks, whether that successor will be a wise man or a fool. Yet that person will have complete control over all the fruit of Solomon's toil, all the wisdom and skill he poured into building it. This too, he concludes, is vanity. Solomon had built an empire that stretched from the Euphrates to the border of Egypt. And remarkably, his deepest anxiety was not whether he would succeed in his own lifetime, but what would inevitably happen to everything he had built after he was gone from the earth. He could not control who would inherit it. He could not guarantee that his son would honor what he had built, rather than squander it or actively destroy it through foolishness. And history itself would later prove this fear entirely justified, as his son Rehoboam's poor decisions led directly to the kingdom splitting in two shortly after Solomon's death. This lesson strikes directly at the heart of modern ambition in a way that feels almost uncomfortably contemporary. So many people today sacrifice their physical health, their marriages, the fleeting years of their children's childhoods, all in relentless pursuit of a career or a legacy, believing somewhere deep down that the empire they are constructing will somehow outlive the meaninglessness they privately feel, gnawing at them inside. Solomon, who built more than nearly anyone else in recorded history, tells us with total clarity that this particular strategy simply does not work. Labor that has been detached from a deeper, transcendent purpose eventually becomes a source of chronic anxiety rather than genuine fulfillment, because at a certain point you begin working not from a place of joy or calling, but from a quiet, gnawing fear of losing what you have already accumulated. This is why so many successful people report feeling hollow even at the peak of their achievement. The labor itself was never designed to carry the weight of ultimate meaning, and when we ask it to do so anyway, it eventually breaks under that weight, just as Solomon discovered it would. Lesson 6: Two are better than one. In the middle of this book, saturated with warning after warning about the emptiness of wealth, pleasure, and personal achievement, Solomon pauses to offer one of the most beautiful and enduring reflections on companionship found anywhere in Scripture. Two are better than one, he writes, because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow, but woe to the one who is alone when he falls and has no one to help him up. Again, if two lie together they keep warm, but how can one keep warm alone? And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, two will withstand him. A threefold cord, he concludes, is not quickly broken. After chapter upon chapter of methodically exposing the emptiness at the core of wealth, pleasure, and every form of achievement Solomon could test, he finally pauses to name something that is genuinely not vanity, something that actually holds real and lasting weight in a life otherwise filled with vapor. Relationship, companionship, the people who walk faithfully beside us through the difficult seasons of life. This is a striking and even poignant pivot, coming from a man who, according to the historical record, had 700 wives and 300 concubines, and who apparently came to understand, perhaps too late in his life to fully benefit from the realization, that a vast quantity of relationships means absolutely nothing without genuine depth in even one of them. This lesson quietly and gently corrects the isolation that so many ambitious, driven, achievement-oriented people gradually fall into over the course of their lives, often without even noticing it happening, until they look up one day and realize they are entirely alone at the top of whatever mountain they climbed. It reminds us, with unusual tenderness, especially given the surrounding tone of the book, that no achievement, however impressive, is ultimately worth the devastating cost of walking through this life utterly alone, with no one beside you to offer their hand when you inevitably stumble and fall. Lesson 7. Wealth brings no rest. Solomon returns once more to the subject of riches, this time shifting his focus away from the pursuit of wealth itself and toward the considerable psychological toll it exacts once it has actually been acquired and must now be protected. He describes observing a man who has no one else, neither son nor brother to share his life with, and yet there is no end to all his toil, and his eyes are never satisfied with the riches he continues to accumulate. For whom, Solomon asks on this man's behalf, am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure? This too, he concludes, is vanity and an unhappy business. He goes even further in his observation, noting with piercing insight that the sleep of a laborer is sweet, whether he eats little or much, but the full stomach of the rich man will not permit him to sleep. This may be one of the most quietly devastating observations contained anywhere in the entire book. The poor laborer, physically exhausted from a full day of honest, demanding work, lies down and sleeps peacefully through the night. The wealthy man, by contrast, surrounded by every material abundance imaginable, lies awake staring at the ceiling, anxious about protecting everything he has accumulated, worried about the possibility of losing it, endlessly calculating and recalculating his holdings in his mind. Wealth, in other words, does not purchase the rest that we so instinctively assume it will. In a great many cases, it actually steals rest away entirely, quietly replacing the honest physical exhaustion of labor with a restless mental exhaustion that never fully allows the mind to release its grip, even for a single night. This particular lesson challenges one of the deepest and most unquestioned assumptions embedded in modern life: the persistent belief that if we simply accumulate enough resources, enough savings, enough security, we will finally be able to relax and exhale. Solomon watched wealthy men in his own kingdom lose sleep night after night over money they could not possibly spend across 10 lifetimes, and he wants us, through his own recorded observation, to see the trap clearly before we walk directly into it ourselves. Lesson 8. Death equalizes every man. Solomon now confronts the reality of mortality with a bluntness that few religious texts, ancient or modern, allow themselves to express so openly. He observes with unflinching honesty that the very same fate awaits both the wise man and the fool alike. As it happens to the fool, he writes, so it will happen also to me. Why then have I been so very wise? Then I said in my heart, this also is vanity, for there is no enduring remembrance of the wise man any more than of the fool, seeing that in the days already coming both will have long since been forgotten. So he says, I hated life, because what is done under the sun was grievous to him. This particular chapter has genuinely troubled thoughtful readers for centuries, because it appears at first glance to strip all meaning away from any effort to distinguish yourself through righteousness, through wisdom, through building something intended to last beyond your own lifetime. Solomon looks unflinchingly into the open grave and admits, without any attempt to soften the blow, that death simply does not care about your accomplishments, your resume, or your reputation. The king and the humble servant end up buried in the very same ground, indistinguishable to the earth that eventually receives them both. And yet this brutal, uncomfortable honesty ultimately serves a crucial purpose within the larger structure of the book. It strips away the false and fragile comfort of legacy as ultimate meaning, forcing the honest reader to search for something that death itself cannot erase or diminish. If wisdom cannot save you from the grave, and wealth cannot save you from the grave, and power and influence cannot save you from the grave, then whatever genuine meaning exists in this life must necessarily be found somewhere that death has no power to touch. Solomon is deliberately clearing the ground here, tearing down every false foundation one by one, so that later in the book he can finally point us toward the one thing that actually remains standing after everything else has been swept away. Lesson 9. Injustice exists under the sun. Solomon, in his role as king, sat as the highest court of appeal and the final judge in the entire land, and yet he writes with startling and uncomfortable honesty about what he personally witnessed from that elevated position. Again I saw, he writes, all the oppressions that are done under the sun, and behold, the tears of the oppressed, and they had no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors there was power, and there was no one to comfort the oppressed. And I thought, the dead who are already dead, more fortunate than the living, who are still alive. This is not the voice of a naive or sheltered ruler, pretending that his kingdom operated as a flawless utopia of perfect justice. This is a king, the wisest ruler his nation had ever known, openly admitting that even with all his wisdom, even with his considerable authority, even with the most sophisticated legal systems he was able to establish and enforce, genuine injustice persisted stubbornly throughout his kingdom, often with no earthly remedy available to those who suffered under it. Solomon does not offer his readers an easy or comfortable explanation for why God permits this kind of suffering to continue. He does not attempt to resolve the tension for us. He simply names the reality honestly, refusing to pretend that righteousness is always rewarded and wickedness always punished within the visible boundaries of a single human lifetime. This particular lesson quietly grants permission for something that many people of genuine faith are often deeply afraid to admit, even to themselves, that the world is, in fact, genuinely and often severely unfair, that suffering frequently falls upon the entirely innocent, while the guilty continue to prosper unpunished, and that honestly acknowledging this painful reality is not some failure of faith, but rather an honest and necessary reckoning with the world, exactly as it actually is, rather than as we might wish it to be. Solomon's raw honesty here becomes, somewhat unexpectedly, one of the most genuinely comforting sections of the entire book for anyone who has ever suffered a deep injustice and privately wondered whether their pain was somehow their own fault. Lesson 10. Fear God. The conclusion of the whole matter. After 11 full chapters of methodically dismantling every illusion, every false comfort, every idol the human heart naturally builds for itself over the course of a lifetime, Solomon finally arrives at his ultimate conclusion, and it is the hinge upon which the entire book of Ecclesiastes actually turns. The end of the matter, he writes, all having been heard, is this: fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every secret thing, whether it is good or whether it is evil. After all the vapor Solomon chased across the preceding chapters, after all the futile chasing after wind, after wealth failed repeatedly to satisfy his deepest longings, after pleasure inevitably faded no matter how it was intensified, after wisdom itself brought grief rather than the peace he expected, after death efficiently erased every legacy he had labored so hard to construct, Solomon does not end his book in despair. He ends remarkably in reverence. He points decisively beyond all the vapor he has spent the entire book documenting, toward the one thing that was never vapor to begin with: the eternal God who sees every hidden thing and who will ultimately bring true justice to a world where earthly justice so often and so visibly failed. This is not some hastily tacked-on religious ending, added merely to satisfy expectations. It is the precise answer the entire book has been carefully building toward from its very first devastating sentence. Every single earthly pursuit that Solomon personally tested throughout his life eventually turned to mist in his hands, not because those things were inherently evil, but because none of them were ever designed or intended to hold the weight of ultimate meaning. That Solomon, and every one of us instinctively tries to place upon them. Only the fear of God, only a life deliberately oriented toward the eternal rather than endlessly toward the temporary, could actually hold the weight that Solomon had been searching for his entire remarkable life. This is precisely why the wisest man, the wealthiest man, the most experienced man who has ever lived, after personally trying absolutely everything this world has to offer, tells you plainly at the very end of his search, this and only this is where you must begin. Closing. Solomon spent an entire lifetime testing every avenue the human heart could possibly imagine, and he returned from that exhaustive search with a single, unshakable conclusion. The things of this world, however impressive they may appear, however pleasurable they may feel in the moment, however wise they may seem, are ultimately vapor. They simply cannot hold the weight of your soul, no matter how desperately you try to make them. But Solomon did not leave us stranded without an answer. Fear God. Walk humbly before him each day. Remember your Creator, not merely at the very end of your life, when the years have already slipped away, but now, today, in the days of your strength, before the difficult years arrive when you find yourself saying, "I find no pleasure in them." If any part of this message spoke directly to something in your own life today, please share it with someone in your life who needs to hear these words, and subscribe to the Journey Bible Stories, where every single week we return once again to the timeless words of Scripture to rediscover the wisdom our modern world has so thoroughly forgotten.